Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. Who is your favorite president of all time? Man, I love George Washington. Teddy Roosevelt's pretty good. Lincoln was a strong leader. Who's your least favorite president? Man, I hate Joe Biden. Trump gets on my nerves. Ronald Reagan? Who's that guy? People immediately know who their favorite president is, but often their least favorite president is rather a really skewed recent political belief, or just some random hatred for Calvin Coolidge. Like, what did he ever do to you? But today, we're legitimately talking about one of the worst presidents in American history, James Buchanan. He's easily regarded as a bottom two president, and it kind of goes back and forth depending on who you ask if he's actually the worst in history. But what makes Buchanan interesting is that for a lot of his life, he actually looked like he'd be a pretty good president. He had the resume, he had the experience, and he had the patience. But as the country changed and the pressure mounted leading up to that Civil War, James Buchanan's true leadership really came out. And in this episode, I'm going to argue that he wasn't necessarily a bad leader. He just was pushing back all the bad stuff so that the next guy would have to deal with it. But what that ended up is making him look like a wimp. I'm sorry, James Buchanan. It's a tough story to tell, and I actually think your life had some pretty good stuff in it. But, I'd say the truth here, and I'm just going to let you know that your presidency was not too spectacular. Let's do this. James Buchanan was born into a pretty wealthy family in Pennsylvania, which gave him access to everything he needed to be a politician, an education, and a lot of connections early on in his life. After college, he became a pretty successful lawyer. That's often a step to the presidency, earning a reputation as an intelligent, disciplined, and cautious man. That caution followed him throughout his career. He's also the only president in American history who never married, and is definitely the first thing you hear when people mention James Buchanan. Some people have gone as far as to argue that James Buchanan was America's first and only homosexual president. Whoa, Ty, hold on a second. Are you serious? For a good while, James Buchanan lived in a bachelor house with a bunch of guys. Most of them eventually moved out, except for one guy, William Rufus King, who later became the vice president under Franklin Pierce. Buchanan and William King were sometimes jokingly referred to as partners. Don't say that about your guy friends. It doesn't look too good. This claim has fueled a lot of modern speculation, but I promise there is no solid historical evidence to support the claim. So I can promise you that James Buchanan was not some 19th century LGBTQ representative. But it does show how history can really take a lonely personal life and turn it into something much larger than it really was. He was actually engaged to a woman at one point. Her family did not like Buchanan, and the engagement was eventually broken off. That's bad enough, okay? But A few days after this, she died by suicide. And don't think James Buchanan didn't blame himself for this for the rest of his life. The moment really affected him, and it's hard not to see how it might have contributed to his withdrawn personality and his tendency to avoid confrontation and women for a good portion of his life. But now that we're out of that controversy, politically, yet again, Buchanan had a really good resume to be the president. He served as a congressman, a senator, a minister to Russia, a minister to the UK, and eventually he became the Secretary of State under James K. Polk. The Secretary of State, to put it pretty simply, helps the president in a lot of wartime stuff and just pretty much what the president does, but on a lower level. And as we've seen in history with figures like Thomas Jefferson and others, being a Secretary of State for somebody very often leads to the presidency. But here's where it becomes difficult. James K. Polk is one of my favorite presidents, by the way, because he was so efficient. He set goals, he accomplished them, and then he left office. But during Polk's presidency, the United States fought in the Mexican-American War, a deeply divisive conflict. This was exactly the kind of moment where a strong Secretary of State could make an impact. But Buchanan seemed less interested in helping James K. Polk deal with the war and more interested in positioning himself and fixing his receding hairline to make himself look like a future president. Critics noticed this at the time and accused him of using the office not to help, but to build his own reputation rather than to serve the country. That strategy backfired. In the election that followed, Buchanan lost to Zachary Taylor, largely because Zachary Taylor was popular and Buchanan was not. People didn't hate Buchanan, they just really didn't know him. But something that would shock America is that Buchanan was not just going to give up. He was going to come back for more. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. See you there. (1848), 1852. Man, am I ever going to win the presidency? 1856. Good job, James Buchanan. He finally won the presidency after many runs for the office. When he won the presidency, nobody was really mad, per se. He just seemed like a dedicated politician who was eventually going to get his turn. But when he entered office, he drew the short straw on current events because, were there some decisive ones. The country was in chaos. The 1850s were dominated by, knock knock, slavery. And it wasn't just a debate anymore. It wasn't just I believe this, you believe this. No, people were literally dying because of slavery. Violence was coming out of random places like Kansas over people fighting if slavery should expand, if it should end entirely, or if we should keep it where it is and not let it move on. A lot of stuff, okay? It was a brutal time to be alive in America. The problem in this presidency is that Buchanan really didn't stand on a specific side. While Zachary Taylor eventually took a stance, Buchanan did not. He was a Northerner, he was from Pennsylvania, but he often sympathized with Southern slaveholders. That earned him the very humorous label of a doughface.
A doughface is somebody who squeezes and molds their ideas into whoever they're talking to, meaning they don't really have many ideas at all.
And it wasn't just him. He filled his cabinet with men whom were Southerners, some of whom would later join the Confederacy. But hold on, he's not doing anything bad yet. For a short time, it didn't seem disastrous. Until 1857, just 1 year into his presidency. That's when something called the Dred Scott decision emerged. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner had taken him into the free territories. And Dred Scott believed that made him free. The Supreme Court not only ruled against Dred Scott, a slave who should have been freed, but they declared that black Americans were not citizens at all, and Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories. Even though Buchanan wasn't really necessarily involved, members of his cabinet were. And it was one of the most damaging decisions in American history. Actually, probably the worst Supreme Court decision in history. What made it worse is that Buchanan didn't really distance himself from this event. He endorsed it. He might not have been directly affiliated, but he said that it was correct. What? That move destroyed trust across the North. And it made future leaders need a person like Abraham Lincoln, who would take a strong stance and not just stay in the shadows until it was already done and say, yeah, I agree with that. Now, the Dred Scott decision would be remembered as one of the worst pieces of a presidency already, but Buchanan wasn't done. At the same time, the country was hit with the Panic of 1857. The economy collapsed. The nation was divided over slavery, and Americans were realizing that they had not had a good president in 12 years. Zachary Taylor was okay. Millard Fillmore was not good. Franklin Pierce was an alcoholic who was traumatized because of his child's death and couldn't focus on the presidency. And now we had James Buchanan, who was just going to mold to whoever he was talking to. It was not good. We needed a hero. And 1860 brought us that hero. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, oh my gosh, what a guy. Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to do a separate episode just kind of about the Civil War later, because we have to remember the extent of what Lincoln did. Lincoln might not have been perfect, nobody is, but Lincoln had to deal with a time in our nation's history that, oh my gosh, was incomparable to anything else anyone had ever seen. And the way he dealt with it was pretty extraordinary. But Buchanan didn't want any of these Civil War ideas to run into his legacy. So that's what happened. Buchanan just kind of pushed the slavery issue as far as it could possibly go until it couldn't go anymore, just so that he wouldn't be credited with starting the Civil War. Even though you did, Buchanan. That's not leadership. At all. It actually is pretty horrific in American history. Finding a problem that's really big and, I don't know, could divide the nation, push that onto somebody else. Leadership is taking that charge. But I've said a lot of hate, and I'm going to give a little respect to James Buchanan real quick. He believed deeply in an idea that I love. Finding common ground. The 1840s and 1850s actually very much reflect our politics today. People will find any reason to bring up any possible disagreement that they have stored in their mind. Man, I love Dunkin' Donuts. I hate Dunkin' Donuts. I love Starbucks. My lawnmower has a steering wheel. I hate zero turns. I'm starting to realize that these analogies are extremely southern, so for my northern listeners, I'm sorry. But trying to make the point, even though Buchanan really didn't do it much during his presidency, during his political career, he really tried to find common ground. Common ground is not common today. We tend to find our differences before we find our similarities. Oh, yeah, man, I'm kind of a dog person. Oh, yeah, I love dogs. You don't have to mention that you also have 14 cats, Vanessa, okay? Sometimes focus on your common traits and not your disagreements. The biographic show, a great source that I use for these podcasts, made this great analogy. Buchanan built bridges instead of burning them. That's a great quality in so many situations. But it was a very tough time in history to find common ground. In some moments of the Civil War, Buchanan didn't even feel like he could be neutral, because the Civil War was actually so divisive that finding common ground felt almost impossible. And at the time, what Americans didn't know is that they needed a leader who stood with a firm stance, because that is what could change the nation. Americans knew that they needed a leader who fully believed, absolutely 100% felt one way and was willing to stand by it, because that is what could change our country and get us out of this Civil War that hasn't begun yet. Thanks, James Buchanan. But I would argue that James Buchanan isn't the single worst president by an insane amount. I'd actually put a president that we're doing eventually, Andrew Johnson, also in that category. Some days he's worse than Buchanan. It just depends on my mood. But in another time, Buchanan might have been successful. And somewhere down there, James Buchanan's ideals were pretty strong. But let's just say that James Buchanan was not given the royal flush when talking about the time in American history. Maybe someday, maybe in a completely different time, James Buchanan might have been a great president. But history doesn't judge presidents on potential. It judges them on the moments that they fought through, that they neglected, that they rose up. And Buchanan's moments were not great. And that is why James Buchanan is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about, now let me be clear, Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States, the first African American and only African American to rise up to the power of the presidency. But I promise you, the color of his skin was not the only thing that defined Obama. He was one of our greatest presidential speakers of all time. His speeches captivated crowds, and I'm going to read some of them next week. They are incredible. Barack Obama's a pretty recent president, but how will his legacy, how will his impact affect us not only today, but in the future? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow Presidents Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.